Night my son-in-law called me a financial burden to my own daughter's face. I was standing 6 feet away in their kitchen pretending to look for a coffee mug. I heard every word. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the company he'd spent 3 years trying to impress had a silent majority shareholder, and that shareholder was me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eugene. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my working life I drove the same route to the same office building in Mississauga, managing investment portfolios for a mid-sized firm that most people have never heard of. I wore the same style of jacket for 20 years. I bought my cars used. I clipped coupons at the Sobeys near my house, not because I had to, but because it felt honest. My late wife, Gloria, used to joke that I'd have made a terrible lottery winner. "You'd still take the bus," she'd say, laughing, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Gloria passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every one of those months beside her. When she was gone, I sold the house in Oakville, the one we'd raised our 2 children in, and moved to a smaller place in Hamilton, a bungalow with a cracked driveway and a kitchen I never updated. My daughter, Renee, came to help me move boxes. My son, Curtis, sent a card. I should tell you that I had by that point accumulated just under $4 million across various accounts and holdings. Some of it was from decades of careful investing. Some of it was from selling the Oakville house at the right time. Some of it was from a stake I'd quietly taken in a regional manufacturing company called Harwick Precision back in 2009, when they were desperate for cash and nobody believed in them. I believed in them. 14 years later, that stake was worth considerably more than what I'd paid. I didn't tell my children any of this, not because I was hiding it maliciously. I just never thought it mattered yet. They were adults. They had their own lives. And I was, by every outward measure, a retired man of modest means living in a bungalow in Hamilton, driving a 2014 Civic with a dent above the rear wheel well. Renee had married Damien 3 years before Gloria died. He was the kind of man who announced his salary in casual conversation and talked about his investment properties the way other men talked about their hockey teams. He worked in commercial real estate in Toronto, did well enough, and made it quietly, persistently clear that he found me underwhelming. He never said it directly. He didn't have to. It was in the way he explained things to me, slowly, with that slight tilt of the head, as if I might need extra time to follow along. Curtis lived out in Calgary and mostly kept his distance. We spoke on birthdays, sometimes Christmas. He borrowed money from me twice in his 30s and paid it back late without interest, without acknowledgement. When I mentioned it once, gently, he told me he'd been under a lot of stress. I let it go. After Gloria died, Renee and Damien had me over for dinner every few weeks. I was grateful for it. I am not by nature a man who asks for much. But the silence in that Hamilton bungalow was a particular kind of heavy, and it helped to sit at someone else's table. I brought wine when I came. Nothing fancy, a decent Niagara Red I'd found at the LCBO. Damien always set it aside and opened something else. The comments started small. A look exchanged between them when I mentioned I was still thinking about whether to replace my car. A pause when I said I'd decided to skip a trip to visit Curtis because the flights were expensive. Renee once touched my arm and said in a soft voice that she clearly felt was kind, "Dad, you know we could help you if you needed it, right?" As though I were on the edge of something. As though she were doing me a favor by not saying it plainly. I nodded. I thanked her. I said I was fine. What I didn't say was that I'd just reviewed my portfolio that morning, that my dividends alone were generating more per month than Damien made in salary, and that I was, in most practical senses, more financially comfortable than anyone at that table. I didn't say it because it felt cruel, and because I genuinely didn't think it would change anything that mattered. I was wrong about that second part. The night I'm talking about. The kitchen, the coffee mug, the 6 feet, was a Sunday in late November. Renee had invited me for dinner, and I'd arrived early to help her with the roast she was making. Damien was in the next room on a call. I was quietly rinsing vegetables when I heard him lower his voice the way people do when they think they're being careful. "Your father needs to figure out his situation," he said. "We can't be his safety net forever. We've got the kids' resps to think about, the mortgage on the cottage. I like Eugene, you know I do, but he made his choices and we have ours." There was a pause. Renee murmured something I couldn't hear. I'm just saying, Damien continued, at some point it stops being family and starts being a dependency. He's not our responsibility. I stood very still with a carrot in my hand. I set the carrot down. I picked up my coat from the hook near the back door. I said to the doorway that I'd forgotten something at home and would be back in a bit. I drove to a Tim Hortons on Barton Street and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes with a medium coffee going cold in my cup holder. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt wasn't grief exactly. It was something quieter and more clarifying. Like a window being cleaned. Suddenly everything was very sharp. I thought about Gloria. I thought about what she would have said. She would have told me to go back to that house, sit down at that table, and say what was true. She believed in plain speech. She thought most family problems were just failures of honesty. I thought about that for a long time, and then I thought about Harwick Precision. You need to understand what Harwick Precision had become. What started as a small manufacturer of custom metal components in Brampton had, over 15 years, grown into a mid-sized industrial supplier with contracts across Ontario and into the American Midwest. They'd gone through 2 rounds of restructuring, expanded their facilities twice, and were, as of that November, in serious conversations about a merger with a larger firm out of Burlington called Coldfield Industrial. I owned 22% of Harwick Precision. I had never attended a board meeting in person. My arrangement with the founders, the Harwick brothers, both now retired, had always been hands-off. I received quarterly reports, reviewed financials, and voted my shares by proxy. The current CEO, a capable woman named Dr. Anand, who had joined the company 4 years earlier, knew my name and communicated with me by email twice a year. The rest of the company, as far as I knew, had no idea I existed. Damien's firm had been trying for 8 months to represent Harwick Precision in the Coldfield merger. I found this out 2 weeks after the night in the kitchen, when I finally sat down with my lawyer and asked her to quietly pull together everything that was happening at Harwick. She confirmed what I'd suspected. Damien's brokerage had submitted a proposal to Dr. Annan's office. It was still under consideration. A decision was expected in the new year. I spent December thinking. I want to be honest about what I was feeling, because I don't think I'm entirely a sympathetic figure in what followed. Part of what I felt was hurt. A real, clean, ordinary hurt. The kind a father feels when he realizes his child's household has quietly categorized him as a problem. Part of what I felt was anger, though I've always been slow to anger and quick to let it go cold and become something more useful. And part of what I felt, I'll admit this, was something almost like curiosity. A kind of detached interest in what would happen if I simply showed up. I called Dr. Anand the first week of January. I introduced myself properly for what was essentially the first time. I told her I'd been a passive holder for many years and that I thought, given the scale of the Coldfield discussions, it might be time for me to be more present. She was surprised, professionally gracious about it, and agreed to meet. We met at the Harwick offices in Brampton on a Thursday morning. Dr. Anand was direct and organized and clearly good at her job. We talked for 2 hours about the merger terms, the valuation, the strategic fit. At the end, she told me she appreciated me making the trip. She asked in a careful way whether I had any concerns about the advisory process, specifically, whether I had thoughts on the brokerage that had been proposed. I told her I had a few. I didn't say anything about Damien directly. That wasn't the point, and it would have been petty in a way I wasn't interested in being. What I told her was that I thought the advisory relationship should be arm's length, thoroughly vetted, and that given the size of the transaction, she might want to consider firms with more specific experience in industrial manufacturing mergers. I gave her 2 names. She wrote them down. 3 weeks later, Damien's firm was passed over. I heard about it from Renee, who had heard about it from Damien, who was, in her words when she called me, blindsided. The deal had apparently been close. He'd told his partners it was nearly certain. She was calling because she was worried about him, about the stress he was under. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation she said, almost as an aside, "I just wish something would go right for us, you know? Between the cottage mortgage and the kids and everything, we're stretched pretty thin." I listened. I said I was sorry to hear that. I asked if there was anything I could do. She paused. Dad, you can barely manage your own expenses. I told her I loved her. I told her to take care of herself. I hung up and made tea. The Coldfield merger closed in April. The transaction triggered a buyout clause for shareholders above 15%. My payout after taxes, after fees, was slightly over $3 million. My lawyer transferred it quietly into an account most people would never find. I bought a new car, not a luxury car, a 2024 Subaru Forester in Wilderness Green, which suited me fine and had decent cargo space for the camping gear I'd started buying again. I booked a trip to Newfoundland for July, a place Gloria and I had always talked about visiting and never managed to. I walked the Skirwing Trail alone and stood at the edge of the cliffs above Trinity Bay and felt, for the first time in years, something close to lightness. Curtis called in May to tell me he'd run into some business difficulties. He'd invested in a franchise operation that hadn't performed, and he was looking at a significant loss. He wanted to know, he said carefully, if I might be in a position to help. I know you're not flush, Dad, he said, but even a small amount would help us get through the month. I asked him to send me the details in writing. He did. I reviewed them. The franchise had been poorly conceived, and the loss, while real, was manageable. More to the point, Curtis had made the investment without due diligence and against advice he'd apparently received and ignored. I told him I wasn't able to help. There was a long silence. Then seriously? Dad, I'm your son. I know you are, I said, and I love you, but I'm not in a position to absorb this. He was angry. He told me I'd always been emotionally unavailable, that Gloria had been the one who kept the family together, that he didn't know why he'd bothered asking. I sat with the phone against my ear and let him finish. When he was done, I said I hoped things worked out and that he should call me when things settled. He didn't call for 4 months. In September, Renee asked if I'd come to their place for Thanksgiving. Damien had, she said, been going through a lot since the Harwick deal fell through. His firm had absorbed the cost of the pitch, and the relationship with his partners had soured. She sounded tired. She sounded honestly more like herself than she had in years. I went. I brought a bottle of wine and 2 pies from a bakery in Dundas that Gloria had liked. At dinner, Damien was quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. The performance was gone. He ate his turkey and talked to the grandchildren about their Halloween costumes, and didn't offer to explain anything to me. After the kids were in bed, we sat in the living room with the television on low, and at some point he said, without looking at me, I'm sorry if I've ever made you feel like less than you are, Eugene. I thought about what Gloria would have done. She would have reached over and squeezed his hand and said something warm and true that made everyone feel better. She was that kind of person. I'm not quite that kind of person, but I'm trying. I appreciate that, I said. It means something. We left it there. And in the space of that quiet room with the grandchildren's drawings taped to the fridge visible through the doorway, I thought, this is enough. Not everything needs to be overturned. Some things just need to be seen clearly. I still live in the Hamilton bungalow. I've repainted the kitchen, a warm gray that Gloria would have liked, I think, and I finally fixed the cracked driveway. I go to Newfoundland once a year now. I have coffee on Tuesday mornings with a retired engineer from my neighborhood named Cecil, who knows more about hockey than anyone I've ever met and nothing about finance. And we talk for 2 hours, and it's exactly enough. My grandchildren are growing up. Renee calls more often than she used to. Curtis and I are, slowly, finding our way back to something real. I don't know exactly what shape it will take. What I know is this. I spent most of my life being underestimated by people who looked at my dented car and my Sobeys coupons and thought they understood the whole picture. And for a long time, I let that slide because it didn't seem worth the energy. I had Gloria, and I had my work, and I had enough quiet satisfaction in knowing what I knew. Now Gloria is gone, and the work is done, and what I have left is the choice of how to spend whatever time remains. I choose to spend it honestly. I choose to spend it without pretending to be less than I am or more than I am either. I choose to spend it in places that feel like truth, on cliffs above cold water, in warm kitchens, at tables where no one has to prove anything. The money was never the point. It was never a weapon and it was never a disguise, even when other people made it into both. It was just the accumulation of a long life of paying attention. I paid attention, and in the end, that was enough. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being underestimated by people who are supposed to know you. Not the loneliness of an empty house. I'd learned to live with that after Gloria died. This was something else. The loneliness of sitting at your daughter's dinner table and understanding, clearly and without drama, that the people passing you the potatoes had quietly decided you were less than you were. I didn't correct them right away, and I've thought about that choice many times since. What I've come to believe is that the way things unfolded with Damien, with Curtis, with the Harwood deal, none of it was accidental in the way we usually mean that word. It wasn't luck, good or bad. It was consequence. Damien spent years making small decisions that revealed his character. The wine set aside, the slow explanations, the voice lowered in the kitchen when he thought I wasn't near enough to hear. Those weren't isolated moments. They were a pattern. And patterns, if you pay attention long enough, always resolve into something true. I paid attention. That was the only thing I did that could be called deliberate. I watched, I thought carefully before I acted. And when I did act, I tried to do it with a clear head rather than a wounded one. That's not virtue exactly. It's closer to discipline, the kind you build slowly over decades of doing work that requires you to think past the feeling of the moment and toward what's actually there. Gloria had it naturally. I had to learn it the hard way. What I know now at 67 is that the quality of a person's life tends to follow the quality of their judgment, not their income, not their connections, not their luck. Damien was not a stupid man. He was a man who had stopped questioning his own assumptions. He'd decided without examination that a retired man in a dented Civic wasn't worth taking seriously. That assumption cost him a significant contract. Not because I planned it as punishment, but because assumptions that aren't examined eventually run into reality. Reality is patient. Curtis's situation was different, and I feel it more. He is my son, and the distance between us is something I carry. But I've also had to be honest with myself about what it would have meant to hand him money he hadn't earned and wouldn't learn from. Genuine care for someone sometimes looks like withholding the thing they're asking for. That's one of the harder truths of being a parent, that love without discernment isn't really love. It's avoidance wearing a generous face. What I hope for, when I think about Renee and the slow warming that's happened between us since that Thanksgiving dinner, is that what she sees in me now is not a corrected version of the man she'd underestimated. I hope she sees who I always was. A man who paid attention. A man who worked quietly and without complaint. A man who kept going after the worst loss of his life, not because he was strong in any dramatic sense, but because giving up would have dishonored the years he'd had with someone worth honoring. The money was real. The Harwick stake, the payout, the accounts, all of it real. But it was never the source of anything that actually mattered. It was just what happened when someone spent 40 years making careful decisions and not spending what he didn't need to spend. The source of what mattered was something simpler and harder to hold on to. The choice, made quietly and again, to be honest about what was true, thoughtful about what was right, and steady enough to wait for the two to meet. I'm still working on that. I suspect I will be for whatever time remains.